extremely well known for his work in biology, so through the theories of autopoiesis, autonomy, slightly less theory of natural drift, specific theory of evolution. Then cognitive science, of course, enaction, embodied cognition, neurophenomenology, and ultimately phenomenology itself. This, of course, raises the question, aren't we here dealing with what I called here the embarrassment of riches? You know, what is it that ties this together, if anything at all? And the central theme, the central topic of my talk will be that there is indeed a common denominator underpinning all these seemingly heterogeneous approaches, and it is an attempt to develop a different understanding of life, a different understanding of vitality. Understanding which is in contrast to many of the reductionist approaches, and not only, let's say, on superficial level, although these themselves are extremely important, but also on more fundamental levels, as I hope I will be able to show. I will try to do this in two steps. So first, I would like to outline a broader ideational philosophical horizon within which Varela was operating, and which I will designate by the attempt to overcome the Cartesian heritage. It's not the most brilliant designation. It's rooted in what Varela himself was using as a term. But this particular step is crucial, extremely important to be able to understand Varela's project as such. Otherwise, one can easily get bogged down by the details or just get caught up in a very specific theory or model that he was developing. The second thing, and I will try to focus in or hone in on this Varela's attempt to revitalize life, pun intended. And I will focus here particularly on his idea or his notion of the Janus-Faced, two-faced nature of life. So life that can, that is both given as that which is living and life as that which is lived or lived through. Okay, let us start with the first step, the overcoming of the Cartesian heritage. When I talk about Cartesian heritage, I'm not specifically referring solely to Descartes, of course. I am referring to a very specific epistemic rupture, epistemic shift, epistemic transformation that occurred between 16th and 18th century, and that I was alluding to or referring to explicitly during several discussions yesterday. So this particular rupture is closely related to the development of a distinct thought style. I'm using this particular term. I prefer it to, for instance, terms like paradigm, because this is the term that was introduced by the Polish-Jewish microbiologist and sociologist slash philosopher of science, Ludwig Fleck. And the reason why I like it is because it underscores that a thought style is not merely something that is intellectual. Yeah? It relates to not only how you think about things or phenomena, but how you see them, how you perceive them, how you engage with them, even how you effectively relate to them. This is what Fleck specifically talks about. And one of the things that is characteristic about this thought style, and of course we could have not only one but several lectures on this particular topic alone, so this is of course a very, very rudimentary, a very, very inadequate account of this particular thought style, but something that is particularly relevant for our discussion is at least the following, that what happened here is a development of new understanding of nature and knowledge, a very specific understanding of nature and knowledge. And I try to summarize the three features of this approach as mathematization, mechanization, and depersonalization. Mechanization is the idea that you can basically adequately, exhaustively account for phenomena via formal methods, so that you can articulate them exhaustively using formal languages. The second approach, mechanical approach, is this idea that in one way or another, nature and also entities in nature are machines, so that they ultimately consist of discrete, causally interrelated entities that are of spatio-temporal nature. And finally, depersonalization, which is basically the idea that to know means to exclude the knower, ultimately. Ultimately, to know, you have to reach the ideal of ultimate depersonalization, so the exclusion of everything observer-related. Okay? And as it is well known, this leads to several problems, namely, nature, as it is given to us, in our experience, say, or as you usually engage with it in your everyday life, also contains properties that do not seem to be particularly amenable to this type of analysis. So not only do I here mean colors, sounds, scents, and so on and so forth, but also, and even more importantly, values, norms, and meanings. Yeah? So this problem that I'm now referring to can be nicely captured by two closely interrelated aspects. One is the term that was coined and introduced by Whitehead, and it's called the bifurcation of nature. Namely, what happens is that nature seems to split into two incommensurable domains, to use this Kuhnian term. Yeah? So on the one hand, we have the domain of experience, which is the domain that is directly given to us, that is accessible to us, but is not real, possibly even illusory, completely illusory. And then there is the domain of reality, domain of proper nature, nature proper, which is never directly accessible, but it is the domain of the real. So you have an interesting split occurring. And then, closely related to this, is the Weberian problem of disenchantment. This famous split between what is known and what is real and what is of value, what is meaningful. Yeah? So this banishment of norms, of values, of meanings from anything that has to do with the domain of knowing and with the domain of real. And of course, this ends up in a plethora of pernicious dualities, the mind, body, self-other, self-world. Many of these things are pretty much trivial to many of you, but I think it's really important how you articulate them, and that you articulate them clearly, and then see what the implications of this are. Now, as I said, Varela, his overarching attempt is to overcome this particular heritage, and his idea is that you cannot achieve this, you cannot overcome these dualities on the cheap, to use the Chalmers term here, which means that you will not find necessarily a certain theoretical fix or a certain theoretical addition. You will not be able to solve the problem on the level of the content. Instead, what you have to do is you have to find a way to modify the context within which the problem appears. So you do not address the problem head on, but from a side, so to speak. So you need to recontextualize the problem so it dissipates or disappears. And for Varela, this means nothing less than actually developing a different, alternative thought style. In his earlier works, he referred to this, and I actually prefer this to the idea of inaction, epistemology of participation. And the crucial thing for him is that this epistemology of participation has to overcome or transcend not only the epistemic problem of bifurcation of two domains, but also the existential one of disenchantment. And this is not a trivial thing, as we will see. So the way that Varela proposes that we do this recontextualization, by the way, these are just certain hints and fragments, particularly from his earlier works. He never managed to develop a full-blown program, so to speak. This is the closest that you get. But his attempt is that if you want to achieve this recontextualization, you have to initiate at least a change in three domains. So he said, this is how he puts it. The logics used to understand what dialectics is and parts and wholes are. Second, the scientific ideas about the mind, about what mind is, we have to move away from the brain secretion image, idea that brain somehow produces, constitutes the mind, towards a mind as conversational domain, which later became the idea of inaction. Okay? And then the third thing is we have to change the cultural conceptions about the mind, which is the kinds of experience that are socially and individually accessible. In other words, we need to develop new tools that would allow us to talk about certain, for example, in his concrete case, circularities or dialectics in a formal, rigorous way. This is the direct response to the mathematization domain. So it's not about throwing out this particular domain, it's about developing novel formal tools. Then the second step is developing new scientific models. So instead of the mechanical accounts, we need different ways to think about life, mind, consciousness, and so on and so forth. And the final step is what I refer to as politics or technologies of experience. So to counter this idea of depersonalization, you need something that will involve this domain of experientiality into the epistemic practices. So the heterogeneity that we find in Varela is actually a direct response to these specific things. So if you map his works onto these dimensions, you see that they are embedded into a unified matrix. Now the remaining question is, what is the axle around which these three dimensions rotate? And this is where the second part of this presentation enters the picture, namely life. So, according to Varela, the crack in this scheme that I was developing, in this structure that I was developing, is precisely vitality. So this is the entryway or a hinge, how you could undermine some of these Cartesian sediments that are present. Why is this the case? Why did he find life so important? And why is this particularly important for our current event? Because of the Janus-Faced nature of life. Now, the image of Janus and Janus-Faced is not that strange. It found it. You can find it, for example, in Latour. You can find it in Sellers, I was told, although I personally haven't seen it there. But it basically refers to the Roman god Janus, this two-faced god, facing in different directions, and usually it was believed to be the god of beginnings and the endings, of the passages, of the doorways, and so on and so forth. Anything that had to do with some transition of some sort. Now, why is this Janus-Faced idea relevant to life? Here, a good entryway is what Jan's PhD mentor, Varela, says about how we use the term life or to live, especially in French. Language can be very telling in this regard. It can contain sediments that can be philosophically intriguing. So Barbara says that vivre can refer to two things. It can refer either to live on the one end and to experience on the other. And in many languages you have these similar kind of encompassing of these two domains. For example, in German you have Leben and you have Erleben. In Slovene, the very popular language that I'm a native speaker of, is živeti in doživeti. So a very similar thing again. In other words, language or life refers on this fundamental level already to two dimensions. On the one hand, it refers to the living being, that is to say, to the existence in the world. On the other hand, it refers to the lived being, to the experience of the world. Similarly, it refers to organisms on the one hand, that is to say, living bodies, and the aliveness that I experience, the aliveness that I embody, that I incorporate, the lived body. And according to Varela, this is again another idea of his, what is underpinning these two domains, and this is the crucial thing about the Janus-Faced, is this notion of circularity. He tries, this is another notion, another concept that he tries to revitalize, rekindle. He uses several different terms to refer to it, terms like self-reference, feedback, recursion, self-reflection, closure, and so on and so forth, but they all refer to this idea that there is the type of circularity which is not vicious but virtuous. Okay, so now I would like to focus on these two domains, on these two aspects, on life as living first and then life as lived second, and try to show how they're interrelated and why it's important. So, late Varela, when he was trying to account for living beings, this is in the 90s already, he said that living beings are characterized by what we might call two dialectics, two loops. And he referred to these two dialectics as, on the one hand, dialectic of identity, and on the other hand, dialectic of cognition. Dialectic of cognition, identity has to do with the autonomy, the notion of autonomy, and the dialectics of cognition has to do with inaction. Okay? You are more or less familiar with these terms, so I will just flesh them out briefly, and I will try to underscore why I think they are very important, why they are philosophically intriguing, and not just philosophically, also scientifically, in light of what we were discussing yesterday. So let us start with the first dialectics of identity, that is, dialectics that is related to autonomy. This is basically something that we've come across already on several occasions. Usually it is presented through the notion of autopoiesis, although in Varela, autopoiesis is simply the simplest form of autonomy. Yeah? So autonomy is a broader term, broader category. And autonomous systems are all systems that are characterized by this distinct circular process where you have a network of local processes that are circularly interrelated to the whole as a global, a whole which constitutes a global norm. In the cell, this is the idea that we were presented yesterday. So you have a network, metabolic network, which constitutes, among other things, the membrane. Membrane constitutes the boundary of the whole, which allows the metabolic network to unfold. So you get a certain loopy dynamics, which, according to Varela, because it is processual, because it's temporal, it is actually productive, efficacious. This is what is usually referred to as operational organizational closure, and Timotei provided a very nice diagram yesterday, taken from Di Paolo, and I forgot to insert it here, which would be useful, but it was just this idea where you have like these local processes which constitute a certain circular formation, okay? We don't necessarily have to go into this in great detail. What is important is that for Varela you find this particular structure not only on the cellular level, but also on other levels. For example, it pertains also to how the nervous system works, according to Varela, and it also pertains to how the immune system works. So he has a very specific understanding of immune system. Maybe to make this as accessible as possible, just two very similar graphs which depict this. This is the autonomy of the cell. So you have metabolic network, which on the one hand constantly produces the metabolites that constitute itself, but at the same time constitute the membrane, which precisely permits the bounded dynamics of metabolic network. So you have a network constituting its boundary, which allows the network to continue operating. Yeah, this is the most usual way that it is presented, but according to Varela, it can also be used for other systems. As I said, this is the depiction of the nervous system. Here, basically, the idea is similar, only instead of the metabolic network, what you have is in the nervous system, you have a complex parallel system of neuronal ensembles which constitute both themselves and also certain sensory motor couplings. So certain stable sensory motor patterns, behavioral patterns, which allow these ensembles to unfold. Okay? So a similar dynamics. And if this is for some reason intriguing or problematic, we can get into it in discussion. But I think that the general idea is well known, and I don't really necessarily want to spend too much time on it. The crucial thing that I find here is that it is seems to be a very neat middle ground between two extremes, two dualities that you can fall into, namely between vitalism and mechanism or mechanicism. So this circularity, this productive circularity, seems to provide a way out, conceptually, theoretically, potentially formally and empirically, out of this particular rut. The same holds true for the second aspect, so the dialectics of cognition, which has to do with what is nowadays called inaction. When it was developed originally, this term was not used, so the term inaction kind of came to be towards the end of the 80s, early 90s. Prior to that, Varela experimented with several different terms, and actually he was never particularly satisfied with inaction, and neither am I, to be honest. So what is this idea of dialectics of cognition? And again, a lot of ground has been covered yesterday, and which makes this somewhat easier. Once you have the autonomous system, you have a global whole which constitutes its own norm, as Canguilhem would put it, and as Timothée nicely presented yesterday. This means that this particular norm is no longer neutral with regards to its own conditions of possibility. So it tries to both, in a certain sense, determine and maintain recursively its own conditions of possibility, conditions in which it is possible as a unit, as a form, as a whole. Which means that it will start to respond to external stimuli, to anything that comes from the outside, in a non-neutral way. So what you get here is the minimal form of normativity and intentionality, which means simply you get a fold in the plenum of the reality. You have a certain anchorage in reality, so some sort of a minimal intentionality, minimal place of directedness out of which the organism approaches whatever it is that is coming towards it. So here, the stimulus is no longer understood as external information, but as perturbation, which means that it shouldn't be understood as an order or a rule to do this or that, but is more akin to a challenge or a question. I particularly like the notion of question. Why? Because the question, on the one hand, is indeterminate. When you pose a question, there are almost countless ways of answering this particular question, but it is not completely unbound. You know where you're off the question, but you cannot determine it in advance. So it is a bit of a indeterminate determinacy. This is how the stimulus should be understood here. The perturbation is a call to respond, which has many different ways you can do it, but not numerous, like limitless ways of doing it. And this is what Varela refers to as information. So instead of information as something that is entering the organism from the outside, information needs to be understood as this attempt of the organism to modify itself in a way that it would be able to respond to the perturbation meaningfully. That is to say, with regards to its own organization or its own wholeness. And this then is also closely related to this idea of each organism trying to find a milieu, a medium within which it would be able to achieve this, which is of course closely related to the notion of milieu or Umwelt. Varela speaks of the surplus of signification, and correlatively this means that cognition for that particular organism is no longer seen as representation or information processing for reasons that I've just enumerated, but as late Varela was saying, should be understood as sense-making or sense-bestowal. Again, I'm not particularly happy with this particular phrase. It can be understood very unilaterally, which is wrong, but it should be seen as the birthing of sense, which happens in the co-constitution of the organism and its milieu. So this bidirectionality of this particular movement. And again, we have a middle way between two extremes. So between the extreme of the realism, where the idea is that the world is simply out there and the organism is somehow thrown into it, which we've seen is a very often implicitly accepted understanding of the environment. Somehow the organism is plunged into something that is there, and that somehow affects the organism, or the opposite extreme where the organism simply constructs almost ex nihilo its environment. So the inaction, at least this is the main impetus or the idea, is to find the middle way where the organism and its world co-constitute each other in this particular process. So to sum this up, and this is something that I find interesting, living being in this particular understanding is the interplay of these two dialectics of autonomy and inaction. And the reason why I find this interesting, and the reason why I think it's problematic how it's usually depicted when people talk about Varela, is you have the two movements occurring at the same time, which means that the organism, I'm going to speak now in a way that might frustrate some, I apologize for that. The organism can only center itself, and as soon as it does it, it centers itself. So you have the moment of ingression, which is the dialectics of autonomy, the parts and the wholes, but this can only happen if you have a meaningful relationship with the environment, with your own milieu. So being already outside of yourself. But since this is a process, since this is a dynamism, you never get to stand still at a certain moment. And we can get back to this because we have one more step to do. So once we've covered this first part, the life as living, the first phase of the Janus-Faced conception of life, we're now moving to the other one. And this is what Varela in one of his texts says, that what occurs if you take what I've just depicted seriously, what happens is a funny kind of flip, he says. Because what is true of the living beings that we are observing is also true for us. After all, we are also living beings. We, the observers, are also the living beings. So the funny kind of flip that happens here is that in the first step, we were talking about knowledge of life. We were interested in living beings. So life was an object of our knowledge, of our cognition. But now we realize that life is not only the object of our knowledge, it is also the vehicle of our knowledge. It is we as living beings that are knowing, that are cognizing. So this is the funny kind of flip that happens. So in the old terms, this is a move away from observed systems to the observing systems. So not only are you interested in systems that you as an observer that is somehow detached from the whole story are observing, but also you yourself have to include yourself because you are a living system that is doing the observing. Yeah? So in other words, like I said, the scientist or the observer, we are also living beings. So the dynamics that we were unfolding, and it's a non-trivial dynamics, is also something that is true for us. So we are living the vital dynamics that we were talking about. In other words, more concretely, if in the scientific account that I've just depicted, when I was talking about life as living systems, we have this ongoing dialectics between the living body, and its milieu, its Umwelt, okay? Then if this is translated into what we are doing, we have a similar dynamics going on. So our corporeality, the way that we are anchored in our worlds, is constantly engaged with our life world, which is basically our world of experience. So the dynamics that you get when you observe the living systems also hold true for you as something that you live through, that is lived by you. This is the move that Varela tries to make. And Varela never really fleshed this second aspect out as fully as the first one. But there are some interesting intimations and hints in some of his later texts. And I think that they are very, very important, and I think that they also dispel some of the common misinterpretations or misunderstandings of this particular flip. Yeah? This is particularly true of one text that people would not normally go to when they would be interested in these types of questions. It is a late text, it's called Intimate Distances, and in this particular text, Varela provides a phenomenological account of his own experience with liver transplant, not liver transplant of someone else, but his own liver transplant. And he talks about the lived experience here, the dynamics of the lived experience, by using the term, which doesn't then occur in other texts, feeling of existence, which is a text he takes from De Biran. So this relatively unknown, almost completely forgotten, we might say, except for the specialists and specialists, 19th century, I think, right? Yeah? Okay. But anyway, the main idea, what is crucial here is that Varela points out by providing this account and the reflections on what's happening is that when you look at your lived experience, you find a similar double valence, as he puts it. So there is a wrong idea that once you start talking about lived experience, this basically means just going deep, more and more deeply inside and more becoming more and more anchored within yourself. He says that when you're engaging with your lived experience, you have a dual movement as well. On the one hand, you realize that your lived experience is profoundly and deeply corporeal, embodied. So you realize that the depths of your corporeal being permeate your lived experience. And he is providing examples through his experience with the transplantation, with all the procedures that he's going through, the fragility of his own selfhood, and so on and so forth. But there's a complementary to this. In addition to having this embodied aspect, so this dimension of intimacy and depths and mindness, our lived experience, he says, is always already decentered. I am always what I am by being somehow thrown out of myself, being immersed in this meshwork of intersubjectivity, into this meshwork of different technologies that determine who I am, how I am, what my body is, and so on and so forth. And he has a very, very good example to make a point about this, because he literally gets a liver from another human being that allows him to continue living. And he says that my own existence after this basically reflects the history of body technologies that we've developed. And he says that this is an extreme example, but actually holds true for all of my experiences. There is not only the intimacy present, but also always the alterity. And then he provides the classical examples, two hands touching each other. They can establish an intimate connection, but they can never fully coalesce. They can never become identical. So this is what he refers to by intimate distances. There is always this closeness with myself, which, however, never attains a complete fusion of any sort. So why is this important? Because we started off with the problem, with the Cartesian idea, and we've started off with a certain split, where the lived experience, the domain of my experience becomes just something that is accessible, but is cognitively unimportant. Well, for Varela, we've seen that this just cannot hold water. Why? Because study of lived experience, is that particular ground, that particular anchor in which all of our epistemic practices are somehow rooted. So you cannot escape this particular aspect. However, studying lived experience does not mean simply doing phenomenology as some people understand it. So phenomenology is that particular aspect which pertains to the embodied aspect. So phenomenology, what it can give you is the structure and dynamics of experience, the notions of lived body, temporality, and so forth and so forth, so on and so forth. But the alterity, this decentered aspect of my embodied experience, is something that calls also for what I here refer to as the approach of historical epistemology. So the studying of ideational horizons within which I live, the socio-historical frameworks within which I operate, the body technologies that surround me and permeate me. So everybody who's read The Embodied Mind knows about this proposal that what we should establish is this ongoing circulation between science and experience. Hopefully I've managed to show how for Varela this is closely interrelated, so how basically you move from one to the other. But what I would like to especially undermine here is that, again, this experience part does not mean simply focusing on experience as something that is completely enclosed in you. No, it also has elements that constantly go beyond you, that transcend you. And this dual-natured, Janus-natured, Janus-faced nature of life hopefully provides a background against which this can be made sense of, or at least it can be a useful entryway. So, to sum this up, we see that Varela's approach challenges reductionism on two levels. It challenges reductionism pertaining to lives on the level of living beings as objects of study, because his theory of autonomy, his theory of inaction, is a direct challenge to strictly reductionist accounts of life because of these ongoing up and down and inside-outside relations. But not only that, it provides an even greater challenge. It provides a challenge on the level of the meta-epistemological, meta-ontological ways of presuppositions of science itself. Because if you take life seriously, we've seen that the nature dynamics of life feeds into our own cognition, into our own knowing, and you cannot simply brush it aside. It is something that is crucial, essential, something that has to be taken on board. So it is also a direct challenge to the reductionist program as a philosophical, epistemological program. Okay, and ultimately the final slide, there are three topics that I would particularly be keen on discussing if you should feel so inclined. The first one is this idea about there seems to be something very peculiar about the phenomenon of life, where you have an entity which does not so much strive towards self-identity as it strives towards self-differencing. What do I mean by that? It is an entity that has to constantly change to remain the same. It is an entity that is constantly becoming other without becoming un-other. And this is an extremely philosophically intriguing idea, regardless of where you position yourself with regards to this. The second thing is the question of bidirectionality. So there is this idea of the organism and its milieu co-constituting each other. But still, there seems to be a certain something in the organism which makes this relationship somewhat asymmetrical. What is it about this? The last conference that I attended in Budapest was heading in a direction that made me personally slightly uneasy. So this overtly strong emphasis strictly on relationality is, in my opinion, wrong. And there was too much enthusiasm about this and too enthusiastic conclusions that autonomy can just be thrown out and nothing is lost by this. I disagree with this wholeheartedly. And then finally, about the reflexive science, which is something that we were talking about during our discussions, whether this can be of any help to what we were saying, and what does what I was trying to convey today, say about the status of knowing, scientific knowing, and different types and modes of cognition and knowledge. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that accessible and yet very to-the-point presentation. I think we have time for a couple of short questions. Maybe not for that many. So there's a few that have got really short questions, maybe.
2 or 3 maybe, yeah, that's the top we can do.
Anyone confident? Okay, so we have, let's start with Timothy.
Yeah. I hope this is like can answer this quickly. So regarding the first topic for reflection, so we say so the organism has to change to stay the same. So that's like a dynamic of self-transcendence. But then you can interpret this in different ways, right? So one would be like maybe a classical, an activist reading of this, which would be you can change material constituents and the form remains the same. But then I don't think that this is quite going far enough. And I was trying to say this, I was trying to relate this issue yesterday, right, when I said that maybe the form itself should, you have to recognize some kind of dynamism within the form of your organization itself. So how would you consider this?
I am sympathetic to basically your concerns here. I don't have a fully blown or fully fleshed out answer to this, but we talked about this. We addressed this topic via the question whether this strong distinction between organism and structure is not maybe problematic in itself, whether there might be an issue there. And in general, I'm puzzled by what exactly is meant by structure sometimes in Maturana and Varela. But yeah, I would agree that there is, if you adopt this type of conception, you can easily get into a very static, or as you referred to as yesterday when you were talking about creative versus conservative type of reading. In the sense of just maintenance of the same without any shift. But I think that this is definitely the wrong way of approaching it. This is also why I found this idea, which I took from I should have mentioned this, from Henry Bortov, this of self-differencing, so intriguing, especially as I was writing my last paper on some of these topics, on the topic of distinction. And I think that what should be done is to find a way to articulate or re-articulate autopoiesis through this particular lens, to give it this particular slant of dynamism. And I don't know how exactly this would be done, but I think that if you take these two dialectics seriously, you get maybe a certain something that could lead you potentially in this direction. But in general, sympathetic to the issue.
Okay, maybe Paul.
To keep it short, your views regarding the nature of the asymmetry.
Well, that's a good one. I that's the reason why I wanted to raise these questions. I don't really have so I don't have a good answer to this. What I can just say is that I don't see the relationship strictly bidirectional fully. So this bidirectionality, there seems to be some sort of an asymmetry. Otherwise, it just you lose. So, for example, a certain Deleuzian conception, which would just kind of break everything out into a myriad of relations or what have you. I'm like keep oversimplifying all of this. It seems. I mean, it seems potentially intriguing, but ultimately, you lose something that seems to be of value and something that kind of, for example, if nothing else, this notion of anchorage, regardless of how thin this is, how thinly you want to understand this, there seems to be, like I said, as Merleau-Ponty sometimes put it, a fold or an anchorage. It doesn't have to be a break or a rupture when he speaks about these things, but this is what I mean by this, that there seems to be this bidirectionality, but it seems to be asymmetric somehow. Now, how, I don't know. So for this particular reason, the notion of autonomy is not something that I would just throw out and say, yeah, well, this is something that doesn't really fit with all the rest of the stuff. Well, maybe you're doing a different type of project, that's cool, but don't just say, you know, we have to emphasize relations, and then, for instance, just sacrifice the things that also make a certain sense in this regard. So autonomy in this particular sense, I mean, it can be understood differently, but it provides for this particular anchorage. And for me, for this particular reason, regardless of how we name it, we don't even have to call it autonomy ultimately, but it is a certain something that's pointing to this pinning of sorts. So this is something that I find. So for me personally, yes, I think that there is certain asymmetry. I don't, again, know fully how to articulate it. That's why I propose these topics. I know that Timmy has some sort of interesting reflection on this, so maybe we can, in discussion, get to this, and he can share some of these ideas. Maybe
Okay, so yeah, given that we are a bit behind schedule, I think it will probably make the most sense for any other questions. You can try to keep them in mind for less than 2 hours. So we can have maybe a short break and then reconvene at about 10 past 11.
Let's reconvene.